Hey everybody, my name is Kelly O'Brien, Black, Pan-African, he, him, his pronouns. I am with the Race and Social Justice Division in the Office for Civil Rights. Thank you for joining us for Transformative Budgeting for Racial Equity. As I said, you can turn on closed captioning in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and there will be a Q&A after the main discussion. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. We've been doing that for all of our events. It's very important. It's very important that we pay the right respects to a land acknowledgement when we do it. And really, I think every time I do it, I'm brought to a place where I have to ensure that we're all being present. Okay, we're all being really aware of where we are. And so I start off with, I'll use resources and I use DeWamishTribe.org um, so that I can read the exact text that's helpful here, and then I'll provide some context. But I'll start by saying I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And by extension, I say we honor the Coast Salish peoples and all those folks who have been caretakers of the land in the Pacific Northwest. We do this all the time. Now it's really I see it, right? Any function you go to, they'll do a land acknowledgement, but I don't know that folks really think it through or think through what a land acknowledgement actually is. And it's not something, colonizers didn't start land acknowledgements, right? This is a native practice. This is indigenous people started the practice of doing land acknowledgements. And for us doing this work, I think it's really important for us to think through when we're doing race and social justice work, there is an underlying question around decolonizing the space. Because when we're talking about making sure that we are equitably distributing resources to those most in need so that they can have access, we're actually talking about resources that are not at the onset our own, but are stolen and are taken. Um, and when I would teach in person, at the tower, I would say, we wouldn't be here. This building wouldn't exist if families weren't disrupted, if whole communities weren't broken apart, if there hadn't been bloodshed. We wouldn't have this tower. We wouldn't have this land to say that we're doing city work on. Our government is a descendant of that colonizing uh, government that came in here and took over this space. So when we're doing this work, we have to really start with decolonizing the space. We have to understand what that means, right? And really invite an intersectional analysis around how we're looking at race and social justice and how we're looking at how we acknowledge where we start, where we come from. Okay, so the last part I'll say is I invite folks to do something real, something actionable, and to check out Real Rent Duwamish. It's a little tongue twister, but Real Rent Duwamish to provide real support for folks, indigenous folks here. The federal government does not recognize these indigenous groups for a couple of reasons. One being no shared language and not enough members. And those are direct consequences of government racist policy. And so as government employees, it's really important for us to see where our space is in this work and see where we're starting and where we're trying to go. And to start with decolonizing the space, okay? So that's how I do land acknowledgements. So remember to check out Real Rent Duwamish. All right. I just wanted to give it a moment. Okay, we're going to do Q&A after the session. Without further ado, I will allow the members of the panel to introduce themselves. I'll give a little bit of context before I do this. We have been doing work throughout the year and building on work that came before that throughout the departments in the city to have finance managers have conversations with the RSJI apparatus and advocates in their departments so that we can put the budget process through an RSJI ringer, right? A sort of overlaying the RSJI lens in the budget process. So this work has been building over the last year and a half or so. And I really thought it would be a good idea for us to share this with the larger RSJI network and our larger city employee audience. And so the folks that are here are part of that process of sharing out this work from the city budget office. Okay. And so without further ado, I'll ask them to start, and I'll just call on you, Jeanette, and then you can like ping pong to other folks. Okay. And we're doing our, remember our intros, right? Race, pronouns, that sort of thing. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. My name is Jeanette Blankenship, and I am white, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the deputy budget director for the city. I'll turn over to Kailani.
Good afternoon. My name is Kailani DeVille. I identify as white. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a fiscal and policy analyst with the budget office. I'll hand it over to Miguel.
Thanks, Kailani. Miguel Jimenez. I'm with the city budget office. I'm a policy and fiscal analyst, and I'm also CBO's change team co-chair. Rhoda, you want to go next?
Everyone, I'm Rhoda Sheikh. I'm also a fiscal policy analyst with the city budget office. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as Black, ethnically Somali. And I'll go over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Rhoda. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Gassion. I'm white. Identify, our pronouns are she, her, and I'm an interim fiscal manager with the city budget office.
All right. While we get our presentation up, welcome to our presentation, Budgeting for Equity, here at the first, I guess it's second day of the RSJI Summit. Next slide, Rhoda. We wanted to cover a few different topics with you during this time together. So first, we have been on this journey for actually many years. The last couple of years have certainly made an intentional effort to kind of increase our look at how we incorporate and address RSJ in the budget, really get outside, a different perspective, make sure that we think about the closed process that we've inherited and what we can do to make it a more open and transparent process. But what we often hear is that education and just understanding what the budget is, how it's structured, is key to understanding how to engage with the budget. So we want to spend the first third or so of this time understanding the city budget basics. This may be familiar for some of you, but for others, this is new content. So we'll talk about the city's revenues, where our money comes from, and also the city expenditures, how they're currently structured, where the money goes. The second part of our presentation today is an overview of the budget process, the timeline of how the budget is put together throughout the year, different points of engagement, both at the department level and then mayor's office and at the city council and kind of public hearing level. And then the third component of our time together will be to learn more about race and social justice in the budget, the changes we've made in budget development, share a little bit about some of the feedback we've received, and also get your input of how you've interacted with the budget. So we have a little quick survey for you, and look forward to some of the conversation. And then we'll close it up with a few action items and any other questions that we can get to. All right, so let's dive in. First off, the city's budget under state law has to be structured around how much money we think we're going to receive. Unlike the federal government, where they can deficit spend and spend more than they will receive, we need to balance our budget every year. So first we have to figure out where is the money coming from before we set our expenditures and understand how much we have. And obviously you have levers after that of, do you raise more revenue or do you cut expenditures if you need to balance and you don't have enough? But first, where our money comes from. We have some significant sources within the city's total budget. The one you often hear about is the general fund. So those taxes and fees come into the city's budget. It was about $1.6 billion last year. And that is the most flexible resource we have. We'll talk a little bit more about flexibility and restrictions on the next slide. But general fund there at 1.6 billion. Then we have the next two utilities. They run their own utilities. We are unique as a municipal government, with Seattle Public Utilities providing water, sewer, and garbage for the city residents. And then we have the electrical utility with City Light providing electricity both for the city and some other municipalities. So both of those revenues last year, approximately $1.4 billion. Again, those are restricted for those purposes under state law. And then we have the Seattle Department of Transportation. They have a significant share of funding that does not come from the general fund, about $600 million. And that is largely from state and federal grants and some other taxes that are restricted just to transportation purposes. There's certainly other restricted sources. You think of like permit fees that come into SDCI can only be used for permit purposes, user fees, certain dedicated taxes, grants. And then we also have voter approved levies. So as well as the Metropolitan Parks District. That we have gone to the voters a number of times and asked for them essentially to allow us to collect more revenue for particular purposes. And we are able to kind of increase the amount that we can levy on property taxes with that vote of the people. And so every year or two, we have a different levy, often coming up for renewal, that will fund dedicated projects and services across the city. Those used to be really for kind of one-time capital construction, because you can't always count on voters voting for the next one. But over time, more and more operating costs have been shifted to levies. So of those restricted funding sources, it's about $5 billion of the total city budget. And there are different types of restrictions. And so sometimes people look at the budget and say, oh, we have $7 billion to spend, all the good things we can do. And just to kind of give you a little more grounding on what those restrictions are, we wanted to give you some examples. As I mentioned, the general fund is not overly restricted. There's certainly a few state restrictions, like you can't just give money away. There has to be a public purpose. But the majority of the city's budget is restricted. We have constitutional restrictions. So the rates and fees collected by departments in places like City Light and public utilities are restricted often under state constitution. And there are certain state authorized taxes like the gas tax that are restricted for their use. We also have just state law restrictions by a passage of the legislature with, for example, the real estate excise tax typically is used under state law only for asset preservation. Recently, it's been expanded a little bit to allow for affordable housing. But it's fairly restricted, as is, for example, the commercial parking tax. These are certainly not exhaustive lists, but just want to give you some examples of restrictions. And then we also have our own local restrictions. I mentioned before our local levies. We have levies for the library, for housing, for transportation. And within each of those levies, we've told the voters, here's what we're going to do with these dollars if you vote for it. And so we need to make sure that we stay true to what we've told the voters. There's also a number of new dedicated revenue streams that have been passed recently by local ordinance. So for example, the sweetened beverage tax was passed for particular purposes, primarily around healthy food and early childhood. We also have, for example, the short-term rental tax that was dedicated largely to equitable development. And oftentimes there will be a nexus or a linkage between that dedicated revenue source or what it's trying to accomplish and the types of uses for it. So while those are great in terms of making sure that we are achieving the outcomes we want in certain dedicated spaces, it actually has put pressure on the general fund where it's not growing nearly as fast as some of our other sources are. And it's restricted, or we're restricted in how we can use those restricted funds, and therefore our general fund kind of picks up all the emerging needs, and further pressure is put onto it. We'll talk a little bit more about that next slide. So on that general fund, it is the most flexible. Where does it come from? Where is this $1.6 billion coming from? About 3/4 of it comes from 5 primary sources. We have property taxes. A portion of our property taxes are unrestricted. A much higher portion is restricted, again, to those levies. Some of it goes to the school district, to the state, takes a big chunk, certainly the county and the port. All take a piece of the property tax paid by each property owner. The sales tax, while we pay, I think it's 10.25 now in sales tax, a small portion of that comes to the city, a large portion goes to the state and the county. So we all divvied up, and again, a portion of ours is unrestricted. We also have the business and occupation tax, where businesses pay tax to the city. This is not every jurisdiction has a business and occupation tax, and for example, the county doesn't, and so they rely more heavily on property taxes and sales taxes. And the fourth significant general fund revenue is the utility tax. So while I mentioned that we have a restriction on how we use our utility payments and fees, or our ratepayer dollars, there is a tax that you pay when you pay your utility bill, and that tax is unrestricted and goes into the general fund. And finally, a newer one, the payroll tax. The payroll expense tax started in 2021, and it actually, we won't start collecting, seeing those dollars in the door until the next couple months. But a portion of that tax is able to be transferred right now into the general fund, and that allows for us to help with our balancing. So the rest of the general fund, beyond that 77%, comes from other miscellaneous taxes, fees, traffic fines, other ways that we collect funding from our city residents and businesses and visitors. So that's where the money comes from. Now, where does it go? For the total budget, as I mentioned, $7.1 billion. About half of that goes to utilities, transportation, and the environment. The majority of that, by far, is certainly City Light and SPU, and then the Department of Transportation. Other portions are much smaller, and just, again, we're running large public utilities, so that makes sense that there would be a big chunk of our overall budget. You see them smaller in part because they're just dwarfed by the other investments. I will note that there are a number of areas where it's not the city's purview to provide those services. So I'll get into that maybe the next slide, Rhoda, if you show that. We have the general fund expenditures. So in 2022 adopted, it's about $1.6 billion. And you notice a big difference, right? Utilities and transportation, which was previously half of that pie, now goes down to 6% of those total general fund expenditures. And public safety, which was previously about 11%, goes up to 49%. So that is due in part because of the function of our city government and why our government was established, what our purpose has been as a government in providing services to the citizens of Seattle, which has been historically, the foundation for it is really around public safety and providing protecting the people of Seattle. So police and fire are a big chunk of the general fund. And some might say, look, we should spend a lot more in education and human services. But traditionally, those have been the purview of different kind of government entities. So education being the purview of the school district, and the state oversees that. And human services typically has been at the state and county level. Over time, as those investments have not kept up with our community needs, the city of Seattle has dedicated more and more of its general fund to, for example, human services. And same in education. On the previous slide, we've dedicated more and more for education. That 6% has been growing because of the Families and Education Levy and the investments that we're making now in both early childhood and Seattle Promise for community college. So back to the general fund, thank you. I want to call out, arts, culture, and recreation. That includes parks and libraries. Those are also supported with levies or Parks District, which kind of is similar to a levy, but goes through the council rather than directly to the voters now. And those can be hard hit in the general fund, parks especially when user fees are not supporting their activities. So During this COVID times, obviously parks were activities were harder to attend and provide. And so we have to really watch both the expenditures, but those also flex when our revenues are challenged as well. So I want to talk a little bit about those challenges. The next slide, we're looking ahead to 2023. And it's not a pretty picture. Maybe doesn't seem so scary when you look at some bar charts, but essentially in 2023, we have projected expenditures of 1.7, we have projected expenditures if we kind of stay on course of where we're at right now of nearly $2 billion, so 1.96 million. Yeah, 1.96 billion, which this is in millions, which is overly helpful. And then we actually have a gap of 200 million. When the budget was passed, it relies on a fair amount of one-time funding to fund the current expenditures. So the challenge we have this year is to identify how are we going to fill that gap. We have kind of commitments and expectations that we will spend nearly $2 billion next year. But right now, kind of what we think is funded, and again, this can all change with the revenue forecast, which Lisa will talk about in the next section, is really around 1.76 billion. We have part of this, and let's go to the next slide, Rhoda, this will help, I think, is that in addition to these significant investments funded with one-time resources, we know that COVID is creating both increased costs and community needs, as well as it's having it's softened our revenues. Where we expect it to be this year is about where where we hope to get to this year with our revenues is really where we thought we'd be a couple years ago. And so while our costs have increased, our revenues really haven't kept up. Certainly the federal government has helped us in filling some of those gaps, but we also recognize there's a lot of community needs out there. And so we're trying to make sure that we're using the federal funding that we've received to respond to community needs, while at the same time recognizing that our base funding, our base revenues have gone down as a result of those COVID impacts. In addition, I alluded to this before, we have a new payroll expense tax. So it just started in 2021. We won't start collecting those dollars until next month. And so the forecast for those revenues, and again, you got to start with, here's what we think we'll spend, and here's what our expenditures will be against those revenues. We don't actually know what those are going to be until they start coming in. And so we need to kind of say, did that forecast make sense? Are the revenues associated with payroll expense tax aligned with what we expect to spend against them? The expense tax is also, the payroll tax is also called the Jumpstart initiative. And so we're excited to see where that comes in. And we'll certainly be working with the council if it comes in either lower or higher relative to where the forecast has gotten us. The final one I wanted to call out is that our inflation is pretty high right now. A lot of you might be feeling that. And our revenues don't keep up with that. So if inflation's at 5%, if you want to just keep paying for the things you always paid for, you need your revenues to go up by 5%. And they currently, especially as I mentioned with COVID, are not increasing at the rate of inflation. In fact, they rarely do. So that's another challenge that we have to confront. So with all that, we're excited about what 2023, what the possibilities are. And I'm going to turn over to Lisa to talk through kind of what is the process for how we get there? How are we going to figure this out? And what are kind of the key milestones? And where might you engage as we think about solving both for this next year, as well as how you can engage in future years? So take it away, Lisa. Thanks. Actually, Kelly, I know you said you would take questions at the end. And so are there any key questions that we want to address now?
Jeanette, there's a question in the chat from Jackie Mina.
Let me pull that up. Oh, you want to read it?
Jackie asks, how do taxes like short-term rental and sweetened beverage prevent the general fund from growing?
So short-term rental tax and sweetened beverage tax, they don't prevent the general fund from growing. What they do is it's a new revenue and it's restricted. So it certainly provides for those needs. I will note that when the revenue does not keep up with what was expected, then we have two choices to make. We either cut what we were going to spend in that space, or we try to backfill it with general fund. So for example, during the last couple of years, not surprising, our short-term rental tax has not brought in what we previously thought. Think about all the Airbnbs and VRBOs that were being rented in 2019. We were not seeing that same rental activity in 2020 and 2021. And so the funding dedicated to what the short-term rental tax is funding, for example, the Equitable Development Initiative, that was way down. And so we had a choice to make. Are we going to cut the Equitable Development Initiative, or are we going to redirect general fund to pay for that? And what we did was actually we identified general fund resources to backfill some of that decline in our revenues in the short-term rental tax, hoping that, you know, over time short-term rental comes back and we can pull that general fund out to pay for other things. But that meant that general fund now wasn't available to keep up with other costs, and instead is going to backfill that new commitment made under the short-term rental tax. So it doesn't prevent the general fund from growing, but it certainly, if those are down, puts another pressure on a potential use of the general fund.
We have another question from Grace. What are the one-time resources that were used to balance the 2022 budget?
Great question. So it's kind of convoluted, but essentially think of it as you have one-time federal funding related to the coronavirus local, state and local fiscal recovery funds, and you have payroll expense taxes and payroll expense tax revenues. And what we did was in the budget, use some of the payroll expense tax revenues to support some activities that essentially were swapped with coronavirus, the CLIFFR funds, I'll use the acronym. And so we have federal funds supporting a number of one-time activities that we'll need to solve for. So we have a number of community investments that we're committed to that ultimately we won't have ongoing funding for unless we identify a new revenue source. We do have the payroll expense tax, but that is dedicated to other uses in the out years. Roland. So I'll turn over to Lisa Gassion to talk through the budget process, and there should be hopefully a little time at the end if we didn't get to questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeanette. As Jeanette said, I'm going to walk through the budget process. So the City of Seattle does an annual budget process where the City Budget Office works with the mayor to prepare proposal for both an operating and a 6-year capital improvement program budget. For most city departments, the process starts in March with direction from the City Budget Office. But for some larger departments, especially, their internal process really starts as early as January. In the spring, departments prepare their budget requests to either increase, decrease, or modify in some way their existing budget. And then over the summer, the budget office works closely with the mayor's office to review those proposals and do analysis and provide recommendations to the mayor's office on what should be included in the mayor's budget. From October to November is the council review process, where the council considers changes to the mayor's budget and then finally adopts the budget in late November. And then the budget goes into effect January of the next calendar year, which is also the fiscal year. So it's really a 9-month process. It sometimes feels like a year-round process, especially for those of us in the budget office, but it's really a 9-month process. So as I mentioned, most departments start their kind of the official process in March, but for some departments who have rates, meaning that they charge other departments for their services, like FAS, SDHR, and IT, their process really kicks off earlier in the year. In fact, we're getting ready to send direction out to those departments today to start their budget process. And I just want to highlight kind of overall that the budget process really deals with changes to the budget on an incremental basis. So departments have what's called a base budget, which is really the current year budget kind of pushed forward into the next year. So departments have a lot of discretion to make changes or consider different policies within their existing budget. And the budget process really just looks at those incremental changes kind of at the margins. So CBO provides direction to departments, typically in March, and that direction is informed by a March revenue forecast, which tells us how much we have to spend and kind of where the budget is at in terms of being balanced or not. And as you saw from the information that Jeanette presented, we know already before we even have the forecast that we have an issue that we need to deal with for next year. So if the revenue forecast is lower than anticipated, departments may be directed to make reductions. And if it's higher than anticipated, then there's more flexibility for new spending in a typical year. During this time, we also work with the mayor's office to identify any policy priorities that the mayor may have and provide direction to departments on how to consider those priorities within their budget requests. You go on to the next slide. So typically budget proposals are due to the budget office in early June, and those budget submissions also include department language access plans and also responses to specific RSJ questions. Over the summer, June, July, especially, CBO analysts work closely with departments to get a better understanding of their budget requests and consider any alternative proposals. During this time, we also do internal briefings with the budget director and the mayor's office to educate them on the department requests and also provide recommendations on what should be included in the final budget. Then in August, we do another update to the revenue forecast, which really sets the final amount for what we can spend in the mayor's proposed budget. And then in August also is typically the time when we have final budget decisions from the mayor for what will be included in the final budget. Over the month of September is really when CBO and departments are doing more technical work to make sure all the numbers are right. We produce a written budget book document that's pretty lengthy. And so during that time is really just more technical work to kind of produce the actual budget documents. And finally, we get to the council phase. So CBO sends the mayor's proposed budget down to council in late September. And City Council has the authority to set budget amounts and also to add or remove positions. From October through November, Council Central staff is busy asking questions of our office and also departments to better understand budget requests or to pursue other council priorities or kind of other alternatives to what they may want to include in the budget. And in November, the forecast, the revenue forecast is updated one last time, which really sets the final amount that council has to spend in the budget. Also, during kind of the October, November timeframe, council has public hearings and also hears presentations from key departments. Then Council Central staff do what is called an issue identification, where they're identifying potential changes to the mayor's budget or other kind of policy priorities that council may want to include in the budget. After that time period, we get draft council budget actions, which are modifications that the council is making to the mayor's budget. We usually get an opportunity to review those as their drafts before the council budget chair releases what is the final council budget. And then that wraps up usually right before Thanksgiving with council adopting the final budget. And next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the budget goes into effect January 1st. And the city's fiscal year is also the same as just the calendar year. And even though we just, have just wrapped up a budget at the, turn of the new year, departments are already starting to think about what is in the following year's budget based on emerging needs or policy priorities. Next slide. And finally here, we just included some resources for you. If you want to learn more about your department budget, you can read the very exciting budget book on our website. You can also sign up to receive council committee agendas if you want to follow policy or budget issues that might affect your department. It's a really good way to stay informed on what's happening at City Council. And then also we've included here a link to some RSJI resources, including some of the anti-racist principles and RSJI truths, which Miguel is going to talk more about. So I will turn it over to Miguel, unless there are any questions.
I think I'd like to start off by first humbling myself in front of this very large group. Right before we were ready for this presentation, we had a prep meeting, and I decided to remind my group and myself to make sure we model our introductions off of the way that OCR has been leading that, and I've failed to do so. So let me start over. My name is Miguel Jimenez, and I identify as Latino mixed, and I use he, him pronouns. And I think I feel a little nervous right now. There's 141 of you here, I guess including my group, and I can't see anyone's face. And this, I've been eager to give this presentation because this is an opportunity for us in the city budget office, for analysts, to talk about what we've been working on over the last year. And it's an opportunity for us to network with all of you, to organize with all of you, and to build accountability for this work. And I think that hasn't always been what everyone felt budgeting was like. We inherited this system, like Jeanette said, from past governments. Budgeting is traditionally an opaque process, whether that's here in the city of Seattle, other governments across our country, for-profits, nonprofits that I've worked at have used budgeting as a tool to keep people out of the decision-making process. And that is intentionally what we are working to change right now. And so, we start to ground ourselves in our anti-racist principles and our RSJI truths. And for us at the City Budget Office, gatekeeping is something that we think a lot about, and the work that our change team thinks about when we are doing a lot of our internal examinations, right? How are we participating as gatekeepers in this system? Many of you have given us feedback that you see us as sort of part of that gatekeeping apparatus. And I think if we're doing a good job of being self-critical, we are, right? How do we use that role to be participants in moving our enterprise towards becoming an anti-racist organization? That is the work that we're doing, right? That is the question that we're asking for ourselves on a regular basis. And being accountable to this community is one of the chief ways in which we can advance this enterprise towards that ultimate goal. So that's where my nervousness comes from right now. This is an opportunity for us to really step out of that opaque structure and move into something that is more accountable. I think another truth that's been important for me personally and for all of us, right, is that, we didn't ask for this, but we're all here as employees of the city, as civil servants, hoping to participate in a system that we want to change for the better. So these are just some of the ways in which we try to ground ourselves in this work. Please feel free, if you are new to these principles and truths, or if it's just been a while since you've had a chance to refresh them, the resources in this presentation will have links, and you can take a moment to refamiliarize yourself with the way that we try to approach this work. You do the next slide for me, Rhoda. Thanks. So another important reminder, right, is that like we are a group of people at a point in time. We are building this system off of work that folks before us have engaged in, and we're doing this within a larger ecosystem of city employees across all departments who are engaged at some level in moving our organization towards an anti-racist, or towards becoming an anti-racist organization. And so where did we start, right? Like there probably isn't a starting point, but to a degree, as Lisa explained, departments submit these kind of incremental changes year over year about how they want to adjust their budgets. And as part of that, that's a lot of the work that CBO analysts have engaged in evaluating those changes and trying to determine if they do or don't advance the city's stated goals of equity or advancing equity, right? And so in those changes, we ask a lot of questions about the impact those changes will have on residents, on departments, on city staff. And those have evolved over time too. A new way that we are approaching that work, that we're asking departments, is how are these changes fitting into your language access plan? And the team at OIRA has really been doing a lot of work to kind of help departments think about that. And CBO has tried to continue to advance that work by including these questions in the change requests that departments submit to their budget analysts for review each year. And this is one of the ways that we evaluate those changes and make recommendations to the budget director and the mayor about which changes will advance equity to the best of our ability within our constrained budget environment. And so that's kind of like one of the ways that we have traditionally evaluated equity in the budgeting process. But we've been thinking about how to do this differently, or how to embed it more deeply in the process. And so that's kind of what we have felt is our starting point, even if that kind of process is evolving in and of itself. As we collect this information, we take it and we package this for the mayor's decisions. And this is kind of how we create the proposed budget. Next slide, please. And so there's a time in this city, right, where we all felt our residents collectively coming together to protest the most current injustice of the time. And this was a remotivating factor for many of us in CBO to find out what our role in change would be. And we felt like what we were doing was not sufficient. We were not seeing the results that we wanted to, and that our residents were marching in support of. And so the first thing that we did in 2020 was work with WEPAC, the Workforce Equity Planning Action Committee, and they helped us build a staffing equity tool so that we could think about, as the city's revenues really plummeted during the very, very early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were considering whether or not we would need to do layoffs or furloughs. And if this needed to be one of the options, which it ultimately was not, how to make those kinds of decisions in an equitable way. And so WEPAC developed this sort of staffing equity tool to show us from an analytical perspective what the impact of those decisions might be. There's other work that department directors are doing and deputy directors kind of coming together to think about. We ask ourselves frequently, what's the equitable impact of this change on this one department? But WEPAC and the department directors and deputy directors were challenging us to think broader about system-wide equity impacts. And so this staffing tool was really one of the first ways that we kind of put that thinking into practice. And we realized that we needed to build upon how we were collecting information from departments in the construction of the budget. And so we challenged departments to think about budgeting in a more transparent way. And the most obvious link to do that was to build deeper connections with their change teams and their change team co-leads. And so we encouraged departments to involve those folks in their budget creation process, how they were going to build their budget proposals, and to keep them involved throughout the process. We didn't really have a prescriptive way of doing that. We hoped that departments would think about their own internal organizing, the networks they had built within themselves for this existing work that's happening across the city. And we were hoping that they would innovate, try things that didn't work, learn from those failures, and that we would kind of try to collect that information and think about how to continue doing this in a more transparent way. And so WEPACs also supported us in thinking about how we asked departments, what that process was like. And we built a strong relationship with the Seattle Office of Civil Rights during this time, who really advised us throughout this process about how to engage departments, where to go, where to engage city staff in making a more democratic and transparent budget creation. And OCR has been a tremendous partner in this space. They really were a chief voice. And after we kind of gave this directive, so to speak, to city departments, we worked with OCR to examine the results of these questions, to see where departments were at, and to find out what our next steps needed to be. I mean, this was an opportunity for us to open the budget process up, but obviously it's not going to be a one-year endeavor, right? Like, this is something that would need to take place over a much longer length of time. And so we needed a measuring point. What's our baseline? How well are we doing this right now in year one? And how can we start to identify what resources we need to deploy in order to do this better in subsequent years? So CBO and OCR worked together to kind of analyze those results, and really the majority of the work was done by OCR in that, to kind of teach us what went well, what went wrong, and what can we do better in the future. Let's see, Lisa says, I've always thought of gatekeeping in a negative light, as obstruction is preventing change by preventing new ideas from penetrating the organization. I think that's spot on, Lisa. To me, I've always thought of gatekeeping in a negative way also, but I think this is an opportunity for us to reframe these things and think about how we can use these places and positionality to make the change we want to see. Jessica says, the process you outline on this slide may not be consistent with how department RSJI teams have experienced budget engagement over the past 2 years. Can you share how you envision the process to play out in the future? How can RSJI change teams work to ensure they are properly engaged in future process? This is spot on, Jessica. Thank you so much. I think this is a clear example of one of the ways that it did not go well in the last budget process. And I think we're okay with that, right? Like, this is a learning that we needed to have and to take with us into future years. It's new, so we anticipate that, we did not get the timing right on this. The way that Lisa demonstrated how budgeting is a 9-month process, and for some departments an annual process, means that it needs to be a continued expectation that departments are involving their change team and starting with their change team co-leads, and kind of aggregating information and disseminating it up from there. And so the first year was always going to be a stumble in whether or not we did that well. And I think the feedback that we've received from directors, from change team co-chairs, from finance managers is that in a lot of places we did not do that as well as we could have. You know, the budget process always moves faster than we want it to. There's always more information that we could take in for making these decisions, and it's hard to add a new step to that process to bring in new voices. And the more voices we bring in, sometimes the slower the process goes, and there are built-in deadlines for how to move this forward. You know, your question about like, can I share how we envision the process to play out in the future is, I hope that, you know, one of the many things we can do is normalize the fact that budgets will be created in a democratic process and in a transparent process. And so that might mean different things for very small departments or very large departments. That innovation probably won't come from CBO because we're a particular size department too. We'll need to work collaboratively with other departments, with change teams, to learn about which ways their departments need to build this into their overall process in order for us to move forward and to improve upon each year. And so I want to keep going. We do have a preview here. We have a tool that we've developed to kind of measure our progress over time, and I'm looking forward to previewing that at our end of our presentation. And I hope that can also support us as we think about how this needs to improve over the next several years. Did I get all the questions? Oh, there's more in here. How can we work together to make exec leadership accountable and working with change teams and co-leads? Great follow-up question, Jessica. I think one of the ways that CBO envisions themselves in this space is to continuing to request this from departments, that this is how we expect budget to be created. And we hope that the new mayor also has that same kind of dedication to this process. Any ideas on how we create transparency within a confidential process? Stefania, this is a fantastic question. One that I encountered with one of my departments. You know, oftentimes in budgeting, we're talking about positions, and those are not just a strategic advisor or a planning and development specialist, right? That's a real person with a family who does that work. You know, we need to evaluate how well we're doing as a city. If these projects, programs, ideas that we have that we're implementing are benefiting our residents, but we also need to think about our workforce and how we are making decisions in an equitable way. I think, you know, working with WEPAC is a really important step in this process. We can gather more learning from them, and I think some of the smaller departments have kind of put together a set of. I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on what they used. They sort of had like a set of ground rules for how people would engage the budget creation process, given that it is confidential at times. And to my knowledge right now, we haven't come up with any great ideas for this, and we're still looking for staff across the city to step into this space and talk about how we create transparency in a confidential process. And maybe there are just certain parts of it that lend better to that than others, and we'll need to step into that mess and figure out how to do it to the best of our ability. Last question here. What about using RETs on budgets? I think that's a great question. You know, it's probably not appropriate to use a RET on every program on every year's budget, right? But we should be using what RETs have been conducted so far to do our analysis on what changes to departments' budgets are having the most equitable impacts. But a RET on the budget process overall, that's a really interesting thought. I'm not sure how that would play out. I'd love to hear more about that idea. You know, maybe that one has stumped me. I don't know. I don't have a response. This is a beautiful thought, though. Okay, I think that's all the questions. If there are no hands, I'm going to pass this off to Rhoda.
Thank you, Miguel. So now that we've talked a little bit about the annual budget process, we're curious to hear from you about how you've interacted with your department's budget, and to see if you've noticed any changes within your department in how it engages with the city's RSJI principles. And so we created a brief survey, emphasis on brief, for you to fill out in the next 3 to 5 minutes or so. And the questions are as they appear on the screen. So the first question is, have you previously interacted with your department's budget? And if yes, what are your thoughts? If not, what are some reasons that you haven't? And of course, acknowledging the fact that all of us kind of engaged with the budget in different ways or in different levels. Some of us haven't at all. Some of us are, maybe finance managers or have really interacted with the budget. And so the responses to this could just vary on based on your level of interaction. And again, going back to Miguel's comments on gatekeeping, we acknowledge that there are a lot of barriers, or there can be barriers in engaging with departments' budgets. And so if that's been your experience, we'd love to hear about that. And then the second question is, are you aware if your department has a change team, and what is your level of interaction with them? And then the last question is, what changes have you noticed in the way your department involves or incorporates RSJI principles in the services they offer? So take 3 to 5 minutes to fill out the survey. And then after that, we'll open up the space for any of us to share our responses, if you'd like, with all of us in attendance today. And Kaylani, I believe, posted the link in the chat. So yes, please take the next 3 to 5 minutes. All right, I think we have a solid number of people. You could keep filling out the surveys, keep the responses coming. So it looks like it's a fair split between people who have previously interacted with their department's budget and people who haven't. And I do want to take a second to acknowledge that interacting with the budget could mean a lot of different things. And I think one of them could be direct involvement in terms of making budget decisions or just participating in the decision-making process. Another example of interacting with the budget could mean, looking up or reading the budget book pages, or the proposed budget or the adopted budget, and finding out what, the new year's, what your department's budget is for the new year, what programs are being funded, or, what programs aren't. And so just reading some of the responses, I think, for people who haven't interacted with it, seeing that there are a lot of comments about how it is, it can be a very, kind of secretive process, are some of the comments that I'm reading. And again, it ties back to the gatekeeping and kind of the budget process not being generally like a transparent process. But I want to open it up to the audience to see if anyone wants to share their own experiences or comment more on that. Either, yes, interacting with the budget in direct ways, or maybe reading the budget book or engaging with in the council process in terms of listening in. Okay, so I'm reading the comment from Belinda. It says membership on RSJ change teams is often viewed as volunteer, and there's a lot of variables in terms of the level of support and visibility they have. With increasing numbers of paid full-time RSJ positions coming online, is it possible for CBO to support the volunteers to make sure their voices are heard? It's not uncommon for full-time RSJ positions to be adjacent to power and get co-opted by management.
Thanks, Belinda. On change teams, we certainly understand that change team is often, volunteer of the time you have available. And our goal right now is just to be able to broaden the tent around who's engaged in budget decisions and discussions. I recognize it's going to be different across departments. So would love to kind of, if you have feedback, love to get it directly about kind of what you've experienced, how we can support both department leadership and staff to be sure, that we can all have voices heard. I think as raised before, the tension between what is confidential and how do we ensure that we have a transparent process, like that's inherent. And the only way we're going to work through it is if we actually work through it together, and it may be messy. And I think, as Miguel noted, we're learning with this and in this with all of you at the same time. There are a number of questions. I know we have some closing. I wonder, Rhoda, if there's anything else on the survey you want to call out or any other feedback you see there before we switch to maybe the last slide.
Yeah, we could go ahead and take some questions.
All right, and I know there's a bunch in the chat. We're probably not going to be able to get to all of them, but I really appreciate the engagement for all. And I want to recognize that Kailani was also going to kind of help facilitate the wrap up. So I'll address a few of the questions and I'll turn it over to you, Kailani. So just checking in. So interacting with the budget book is post the budget approval process correct? And that is, if you're reading the budget book, part of it's just getting educated, right? So foundational is understanding how your budget for your department is structured. And so that's one of the action items that Lisa called out of just read through, what does it look like in your own department? How are your resources allocated to accomplish the things your department is asked to do? And the majority of the city's budget is labor, it's people, the people that carry out the services that we provide to the residents of our city. I know there are a number of questions. I'll try to scroll up and get to a few. What strategies are you employing to examine the base versus the increment? And if we got to that. So, and this gets to, I think there's another question on zero-based budgeting, where the majority, like pretty much all of the budget, when you say the adopted budget, what rolls forward to the next year is the base, except for pulling out, say, the one-time items. If council or the mayor added something on a one-time basis, that gets pulled out for the following year. But otherwise, everything that was funded the prior year is going to move forward to the following year, unless there's some other action that would adjust that. And if action needs to be taken, then it typically is done through the budget process, whether it's removing something or adding to the current budget for that department. Another one, if the process is to do RSJI analysis once city has revenue on the front end, what racial equity analysis is done before taxes are enacted, such as Seattle Promise or a heat and oil tax that are championed as a progressive cause, but are regressive for BIPOC communities? I do know for whenever there is a new revenue, they are taking a look at what the impacts are and how to mitigate those. So for example, on heating oil tax, they recognize the regressive nature of it, and we're trying to mitigate it. But there is an inherent challenge there. And how do you make sure that your revenue sources are as progressive as possible? And it's important, you can still do an RET even after a revenue is passed, and legislation could be passed, ordinance could be passed to adjust it if you get into it 2 or 3 years, or sweetened beverage tax, for example, and you say, okay, who's actually paying for this? Is it accomplishing what was intended to do? So there's certainly opportunities to revisit it. I see another, provide a copy or link of the presentation. I think it should be available when the recording is posted. So absolutely happy to share a copy of the presentation. And I think we're going to run out of time. So I want to make sure, actually, I think next up was Miguel. Did you want to check in? And then it goes over to Kailani.
Thanks, Jeanette. I think we have one more slide to come up here. So a lot of great questions in the chat. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get to all of those. So please try to connect with your change teams. This is how we're engaging our departments as analysts, and would love to keep addressing these and keep the conversation going. As a result of the work that we did with OCR over the last budget process and collecting the responses from departments about how they did or did not engage their change teams, and how they did or did not kind of build out more transparent process for budget creation, OCR helped us develop a draft rubric for measuring our baseline and measuring our progress over time. And this rubric is really inspired by the continuum on becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization. And this has been something that we're going to continue sharing across the city. It is a work in progress, and we are soliciting feedback. We've had a chance to show this to department directors, to finance managers, to change team co-chairs. The OCR staff, the CBO staff have all been engaged in kind of critiquing and building this out, and we're really we're trying to build this tool as something that we can use year over year to see what is stopping us from creating a more transparent and transformative budget process. And like many of the questions you've all posed in the chat, what other areas can we think about from a budgeting perspective that are not necessarily in the budgeting process, but are still having an impact on the city's overall resources and how we deploy those resources in order to achieve the most equitable outcomes that are our stated goals of our city. And so I just want to jump to the next slide real quick and show you all the sort of 1.0 version of this rubric. So, this is a continuum. We're looking to move from the left to the right. There are lots of different ways in which departments think about their budgets, deploy their budgets, depending on what their line of business is, what they're responsible for in the city. And this is a starting point for us for how we're thinking about this. I know we only have a couple more minutes, but this is an opportunity for us to introduce it to all of you and to say, take time to look at this, to digest it, and connect with your department's change team on how you can provide feedback on this, and how you can start to socialize this tool with your staff. Obviously, this is a work in progress, something that we are learning from our colleagues at OCR, something that we as CBO analysts are trying to provide information on, and something that we need a lot of support from on departments about what aspects of this do or do not impact their departments, what is or is not pertinent to your work. So this is kind of an introduction to this. There are several other sort of aspects of this rubric where we attack specific parts of the budget process. Yeah, this opportunity to share what we've been working on with all of you as kind of a sneak peek at this point in time, and looking for more opportunities in the future where we can dig deeper into this aspect of the work. So I will pass it over to you, Kailani.
Thank you, Miguel. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My colleagues and I are grateful for the opportunity to bring some of the work that CBO has been doing in conjunction with OCR to this RSJI Summit. We want to encourage you to write down your action steps following this presentation, and we will be sending out a copy of the slides for your convenience. Please read through your department budget, reach out to your change team, review the draft rubric, and add any additional thoughts to the survey that we've linked in the chat. Thank you again for taking the time to be here for our presentation and participate in this summit, and have a wonderful